In today's video, I'm going to share 3 simple tips to help you save money and make sure that you're saving money in the long run. These 3 tips helped me save about $12,000 when I was living in Japan, and I was in my mid-20s, not making a ton of money as an English teacher. So these tips work. They helped me save a decent chunk of change when I was younger, and they will hopefully help you whether you're in your 20s, 30s, or 40s. So if you like tips like you find in this video to help you live a simpler life, a richer life, then be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future ones. In this video, I'm going to talk about those 3 tips. So here's tip number 1. Tip number 1 is to make sure that you know your expenses. Now, how did this play out in my life in Japan? I moved there. I didn't have an idea of what anything was going to cost. I didn't know the prices. I had a rough idea of how the exchange rate worked, but I didn't really know at that time. This was in the mid-2000s, and I had been told, hey, Japan is an expensive country. Get ready to be shocked by the prices. And so when I went there, I was actually shocked that it wasn't as expensive as I thought, because I was coming from California, which is probably one of the most expensive places to live ever. So I went to Japan and I had to get a sense of what everything costs. So when I went to the grocery store, I would actually use my little flip phone, my Japanese flip phone, and I would type in the amount that I spent every time I went there. I would keep track of literally every yen that I spent. If I had to spend 400 yen to get from my home to my work site, I would write it down. I think it was 440 yen. I can't remember anymore. But whatever it cost, I would actually write it down in my phone, so I had this list. I would keep every single receipt. So for the first 2 months, I would keep vigorous track of what everything costs and how much I was spending in total. So at the end of every week, I would look to see how much did I spend? What is that? And I would convert it into dollars so I would understand what that kind of really meant in my own head, right? And then I would also look at the end of the month at what I was being paid, so what was coming into my bank account. And this is crucial. If you don't do this, if you don't understand how much you're spending versus how much you're bringing in, you're going to be in a world of hurt really fast. So if you're just fresh out of college, or you're a high school grad and you're working, you have to know what are your expenses, what you're spending, because if you don't and you end up in debt, you will no longer have the freedom to make decisions that make you feel good about the direction of your life, because you will be indebted. You will have to follow the instructions that somebody else gives you. That might not mean that the bank is telling you, you have to do this, 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 and this, but it does mean the bank or the credit card company is going to tell you, you need to pay us or you're in trouble. And to avoid that trouble, you're going to have to get a job or stay at a job that you probably don't like with a boss that you hate, and you're going to have to do things that that boss you dislike tells you to do, or you're going to have to do things that might be compromises of your principles in order to make the money you need to pay for these debts that you now have. So it is vitally important that you understand how much you're spending versus how much you're making. And you need to keep track of how much you're spending, at least for a while, to understand the patterns. When I was living in Japan, I would keep track really in a detailed way only for the first couple months. So I think it was actually 2 months, and then I was like, okay, I think I'm okay. I'm saving over $1,000 a month right now. I think at the time, because I was being so dogged about it, I was saving like $1,500 a month, and I realized I don't have to try this hard. It's okay if I don't save this much. I have enough cushion so I can go out and do more things, enjoy more things than I thought. Because everyone had been warning me it's so expensive, I was trying to be really careful and make sure I had enough. And once I realized, you know what, things are good, I can relax a little bit, I started to relax more. Now, that said, I didn't relax on tip number 2, because tip number 2 is something that is so important, so basic, that everyone should have it as like their baseline strategy of getting through life. I still do this, okay? So tip number 2 is to eat at home more, or to cook more, to figure out how to cut the costs of your food. Because there's one thing you got to do every day, and that's pretty much eat. Like, you could skip a couple days here and there, you could skip a whole week maybe if you're a really hardcore intermittent faster, but ultimately if you want to stay alive, you got to eat some food. And the mistake a lot of people make is thinking, oh, if I just go out and buy food, it's going to be a comparable price to if I spent the time to make my own food. And that's just a lie. Anybody who tells you that is lying to you, or they have never done the math themselves, or they've never cooked for themselves. Now, I'm not telling you to try to make these incredible restaurant level dishes. I'm telling you, you need to learn simple dishes. You need to learn how to make something that is nutritious, healthy, and that isn't microwavable, hopefully. You want to make real food. You want to have real food available. Just cook some vegetables, or if you're into salads, have salads. Make sure that you're getting enough protein. Make sure you're getting enough carbohydrates if your body responds well to them. Figure out the diet that works for you, and figure out how you can make your food at home. Now, being Asian, rice is a huge part of my diet, and rice is really, really, really cheap if I cook it at home. But if you go to a restaurant and buy a bowl of rice, in the United States right now, that might cost you $2, $3, $4 for that tiny little bowl of rice, but you could buy a sack of rice for $25 that weighs 20 pounds, and that could feed you for several months. The cost difference between what you pay when you go to a restaurant versus what you pay when you are cooking at home is crazy. You're talking orders of magnitude, 10 times, 100 times sometimes more expensive to just go out and have somebody else make it for you. And a lot of times if you're going out to eat out, it's not going to be good for you, right? They're going to put all kinds of garbage in it that makes your body feel worse in the long run. So when I was living in Japan, I learned to adapt. I learned how to make food that was available to me in Japan. I wasn't trying to make American style food. I wasn't trying to stick to what was available back in America. I was looking at what's here in Japan, what's available, and luckily it's so easy because they have marinated meats and all these things you literally just throw in a pan, and it's still cheap and affordable, and still cheaper than the restaurants, which by the way are also still cheap. So when you make comparisons here at home, here in the United States or wherever you live, do the math. Really consider what it costs you to eat out and what it costs you to just make some food at home. And don't think that you deserve necessarily to have 5-star meals all the time. Unless you're making a 5-star salary, you probably don't. And if you try to live that lifestyle, you're going to be broke real fast. Another tidbit here when we're talking about food is when you are making food at home, it is maybe slightly cheaper to get those home meal service kit things, all those things that are supposed to be super convenient. They give you all the ingredients, it's so healthy, but please do the math. If you do the math, take the time to do the math, you'll realize that buying those kits is a massive drain on your finances. Yes, it's very convenient, and you better have enough income to support paying for the convenience. Otherwise, you're gonna have to get another job, which means you're gonna need to keep paying for those conveniences, right? So you need to balance things out. If you are working so much to pay for so many luxuries and conveniences, you'll literally never have time to stop working because you have built your life to require so much outside support and help that you just can't stop. All that outside support and help costs money, so you're gonna have to keep making more money, which means you gotta keep working harder and harder and harder and harder and harder, and you're gonna feel like you're on this never-ending treadmill because you're placing yourself on that treadmill by spending on all these things that are actually unnecessary and probably not good for you in the long run, certainly not financially. Which then brings me to tip number 3 that helped me save a bunch of money while I was living in Japan in my 20s. It was to actually get a side hustle. So I was teaching English in Japan. And while I was doing that, I was meeting other people, and I started meeting people who wanted more English lessons, like private English lessons. And in Japan, that's an easy side gig, or it was at the time. I believe it still is an easy side gig. And people just wanted some private tutoring, private conversation practice to learn how to speak English, right? So I thought, okay, well, if I can make an extra $30 an hour, $20, $30 an hour, of course, like, why don't I do that? I have some free time. I have the motivation. I want to be able to pay for vacations to Thailand or to go to Korea. I want to be able to enjoy nicer restaurants, which again in Japan are not that expensive. And I want to be able to go out and dance, right? I want to go meet some people. I want to have some fun. I was in my 20s. I want to be able to enjoy my life. So having the extra income from a side hustle can be a great thing as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, as long as you are not putting yourself into a weird position where you're having to compromise your principles to make some money that you're just going to fritter away, right? So in a previous video, I did talk about the very important fundamental principle you need to remember, and that is that it's not the money you're focusing on, it's on the independence and the freedom to make choices that align with your values. So if you are doing the mistakes that I talked about earlier, where you're just spending without knowing your expenses and you're wasting money on all kinds of takeout and food and whatever at high prices that drain your finances, so you need to get a side hustle to even pay for those things, then you need to reevaluate. You need to go back to steps 1 and 2, rewatch everything I talked about to make sure that the reason you're doing the side hustle is because you have already set up your life so that the side hustle is just going to be gain, right? Gain, gain, gain. Now, of course, not everyone is going to be in a perfect financial situation. Maybe you're in a spot where you have debt and you're trying to work out of it. Well, again, great reason to have a side hustle, to work towards paying down that debt and making sure that you are working towards having independence and freedom to make decisions that you want to have, that you want to make, right? I'm not saying that it's wrong or morally incorrect, or that anything bad about you if you're in a position where you really just have to take a job to make the money to be able to get your freedom. That is a situation everybody probably, well, not everybody, but many people are going to be in, and you want to be working your way out of that situation. So when you're doing that, you still want to be paying attention to tip number 1 and tip number 2, because those are going to help you gain your freedom sooner. If you don't pay attention to tip 1 and 2, if you keep spending without any idea of your expenses and income, you're going to keep having to live a life of servitude, and that is always going to feel stressful. And while you can numb that with things like alcohol and drugs and tasty food and all that, if you are stuck and trapped in servitude in a job that you hate, hanging out with people you dislike, taking orders from somebody who you think is a moron, you're not going to actually feel happier. You're just going to have the constant stress that you're numbing, and then you're just wasting money trying to numb yourself all the time. So please, keep the fundamental principles in mind. If you haven't watched that video that I filmed recently, make sure you check the description box and watch that video. And also, I'm curious to know what you think about these 3 tips, and do you have another tip that has helped you save a bunch of money and reduce the stress in your life? If you've got a tip, please drop it in the comment section down below. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos to help you live a more stress-free, more simple life. Remember to keep it simple.